Hey Playas, how you doing? Welcome back to another episode of Playas Guide. On this episode, I'm going to continue on with the State of Collecting series. Today's episode is going to be for the PlayStation 1. If you're a video game collector or retro gamer or both, please consider subscribing to the channel because that's what we focus on here on Playas Guide. You can also find Playas Guide on Twitch for nearly daily retro gaming content, as well as Instagram and Twitter. And if you're looking for a community, please join the Playas Guide Discord. All of these are linked below. So you came here to find out what the status of PS1 collecting is. Now, let me just tell you, there is a general trend right now that we've seen among all the other videos. So if you haven't seen those, please consider checking them out. I've covered the Wii U, the N64, and PS3, and just last week, the NES. Now, this coming Saturday, live at 9 p.m. on that Twitch channel I was just talking about, I'm going to be doing a live collector's guide, so you could join in the discussion if you want, where I'm going to be covering the Super Nintendo, the state of Super Nintendo collecting. We're going to have a quick look here at the overall index of PlayStation 1. So looking back at 2010, 2008, where it starts, the average price was about $10, dropped down to roughly $6 was the low, maybe a little bit below that at some point. Yeah, there you go. So around $6 per game. Currently, it says it's sitting at $14 is the average price of PS1 game. And that seems pretty accurate because the game stores I go to, I'm seeing less and less or no value games, like games that are like $5 or less, including a lot of sports games that they just want to get rid of. There's not as many of them. They're just not there anymore. What I am seeing more of is more high-end titles and, you know, a little bit more pricey popular titles. Kind of what has happened with the N64. We've also seen that. The PS1 is a little bit different, and I would say the biggest difference in the PS1 collecting, if you're a PS1 collector, this might seem obvious to you, is that the PlayStation 1 did something that Nintendo and Sega kind of did, but they didn't do a great job of it. In this era of gaming, there was a big focus on 3D. I think we all know that some of these games haven't aged the best, but it certainly was a historic time in gaming because it was the transition from 2D to 3D predominantly in gaming. And that is still the way things are. There's still, most games are 3D. They're just way more detailed and interactive and realistic than they were back in the mid to late 90s, which is why these games haven't aged the best. The popular games at the time were a lot of like arcade racers, because now you could play those games at home. Well, all of those consoles had that. They all had racers. They had some decent ones, you know, maybe great ones at the time that don't hold up so well today. But what the PS1 did really good, and the other consoles sort of dropped the ball on, is horror games, fighting games, and RPGs, even more specifically JRPGs. PS1, if that's what you're into, that's the console to get because it has the most and some of the best. And I think it would be hard for anybody to argue that it didn't, especially looking at the N64, because Nintendo and Sega prior had a pretty good fighting game scene. Sega definitely better than what Nintendo had. Same with the RPGs, but Nintendo totally dropped the ball on RPGs. And on the Super Nintendo, I mean, they had some of the best RPGs on that console. So the contrast between them is there, and this is one of the things that we're going to take a look at is some of these horror games, fighting games and some of the RPGs. But the RPGs just kind of naturally find themselves among some of the rarest games because they are quite uncommon or rare, and there's a demand for them. So we're going to go through the list and take a look at some of the most expensive and rare games here, and some of the games that I'm talking about that seen a different price hike. Right now I'm seeing Clock Tower, so we're going to open that window up because I know that game was kind of, I don't want to say underrated, but it wasn't top 10 rarity, but it is a rare horror game which fits the bill of what I'm talking about. I think we're going to see some fighting games that have really gone up there too. And the Silent Hill games, they just seem to keep going up and up. And we know those aren't the rarest games, Silent Hill games. We've all seen them around in video game shops across North America and even around the world, right? Those are major titles. Even Resident Evil, that's seen a pretty good increase in price for a lot of those games. So Siphon Filter 3, the 9/11 edition, we got to take a look at that because that is it is the rarest game. Some people don't necessarily consider it towards a complete North American collection because it wasn't supposed to be released. It was pulled from the market. So looking here, price charting doesn't really have a ton of sales recorded dating very far back for this one. This game has just always commanded a premium, and it doesn't look like it's seen a significant jump. It's kind of crawled up here, but I mean at one time it was at the same price range as it is now. So I guess there's not a lot to see there. Let's take a look at Klonoa. So Klonoa is one of the rarest games. It's also a very sought after game. No recorded sales here until 2013, 2014, where it was a $50, $60 game, it looks like. I'd say that's about right. This is one that I never remember seeing very often or for very cheap. You would have been extremely lucky if you ever found it in a value bin. If that did happen to you, let me know in the comments below your story of how you picked this one up. But I've never picked this one up because I've always considered it pretty pricey. And, at this time, I was doing N64 collecting, kind of wrapping up my N64 collection, focusing on that. And as you can see, this one is just one that's just continued to climb up. I'm sure this will always be an expensive game. So if you are thinking about buying it, you're just afraid of, biting the bullet and putting the money out to buy it, I would say wait a little bit, because something we've seen here, and I'm going to predict that the rest of this episode we'll see more of this, where in early 2020, March and April, we saw a lot of games jump. This one's a little different here, though, because March 2021, it just shot right up, and it looks like it's kind of stayed around the $500 mark. I think it will come back down a little bit. You might be able to save $100 or so in the next coming months on this game if you're looking to buy it online and you want to have it now. So I wouldn't rush in to buy it, but I wouldn't hold off too long either on something like this, because you really don't know. Tail Concreto. So this is another one of the top 10 rarest games. Looks like we're going to see this for a bunch of PS1 where there's no recorded history before 2013. I think price charting really started to branch out in 2013 to cover all consoles, and it started indexing the majority of consoles, if not all of them, at this time. And that's probably why PS1 is not documented very well before then. But we did see the general trend here said 2008, so we'll see. So this one has kind of been undervalued for a little while here, because it hasn't really, it's crawled up a bit but didn't crawl up too much, and then it saw the sudden increase here in March, April of 2020 when the pandemic first hit. I mentioned this before in some of the other episodes. This is because a lot of people got stimulus checks in North America, or Like the industry wasn't quite as hard hit as economists predict that it would be. So people were, staying home, not going out, saving a bit of money, and with this extra cash that they had from wherever they got it, they were spending it on retro games. I love it. So Clock Tower 2, look at this. This is really something. It's been climbing up over the years, as most horror games have. If you're not paying attention to any of the horror games or that genre on the PS1, they've just been creeping up over the years. There's a few peaks and valleys we're going to see in some of them. This one just exploded in April 2020, and it's still climbing. Yeah, that one might not come down right away. You might be able to score a little bit of a deal in a couple months on this one. But yeah, these horror games are just going up and up and up in value. And, you blink an eye and you missed a deal because you're going to be paying $20 more or something for one of these games. It is pretty crazy because I would like to have a lot more PS1 horror games in my collection, but where these prices are going, I think I can speak for the majority of people, is that we just can't afford these $400-500 games here. Was this one undervalued before? What do you guys think? Because I wouldn't have included it in the top 10, but if we take a look here, it certainly has made its way up there in price. Persona Revelations, that's a pretty rare one. Let's see, Persona 2 Eternal. I see the Persona games in general seem to have gone up quite a bit. Now, something that could have affected some of this sudden price jump here for some of these games earlier this year in April was that PlayStation was closing their PS3 store. They were shutting that down. Some of these games may have been available there, but as far as I know, a lot of them are still going to be available on PS4 or the PlayStation Now. And if the PS5, I think they're going to be building up their library and putting more and more of these games into like a subscription-based service where you're going to be able to one day probably access the majority of the PlayStation library. But there will always be those games that you can't, and those are the ones that we need to keep an eye out for, because if that does, if they don't make their way digitally available for streaming or download or however PlayStation decides to have you play them, they're definitely going to hold some value, because there's people who are fans of the game are not going to want to let it go, and also preservationists and us collectors and speculators are going to look at this and want to have them too. So this is a game that I was looking at. I've been watching this one for a while, so it was around $200 to $300 usually for a very long time. Here on price charting it says $200. I always seen it at game stores, conventions, any buy it now was more like $250, $300. And because of how rare this game and sought after it is, we knew that it wasn't going to stay there. So I think I certainly had the foresight, and I hope that some of you watching did too, that this game would go up. And it has, but it looks like it's kind of gone up with a lot of games during the pandemic. Now, I didn't see the sudden increase that some others did when the pandemic first hit, but it definitely saw an increase here in January and February, all the way to, April or May. So it's been jumping up there. It's come down a bit, but this is one that I think will stay up there. Maybe not over $500, might come down a bit, but it is not going to be, you're not going to see it a $200 copy, probably a copy under $300 again of this game. So hopefully you pick this one up. PlayStation collecting has really picked up over the past 3 years for a lot of games. I'm sure we're gonna jump into some of those soon. These right now we're looking at the rares, so they've always kind of commanded a higher price tag. When we get to this era of rare games, unfortunately, we don't see quite the rarity that we got to see with some of the stuff on the NES and the Super Nintendo. And N64 had some weird stuff because there was different variants and rental exclusives and stuff like that. So it did have some really rare games, but PS1 and beyond, don't get me wrong, there are some rares, but games had bigger and bigger production runs, and then they started coming out, with collector's editions and player's choice copies. Some of the really rare player's choice copies, like Toy Story 3 for the PS1, like those are really the kind of true rares, are some of the variants that you find among some of the, I don't want to say modern games, but not as old retro games. Okay, so this one just basically followed the trend that we've been seeing with all these other rare games. I want to see this one because these JoJo games have really been going up. This one's just kind of creeped up there, undervalued for a while. I think that this one is pretty rare. You don't hear much about this game. You really don't see this one very often. It must have had a pretty low production run, would be my guess. Definitely creeped up there in price, and then pandemic money friggin' shot it up, doubled it almost in value, and then it dipped. So, because I don't see this game often, I'm not able to really pay too close attention to this, and it's not something I was actively seeking out. But yeah, it had a dip, and then it just creeped back up there again. Possibly this has to do with the PlayStation Store closing down, which didn't end up happening. But I think with a lot of these too, the games are just getting to prices that are a little bit too crazy for the majority of collectors. The PlayStation 1, though, that collector's market is not as mature as, let's say, the Super Nintendo or the NES. Obviously, they're older consoles, and that's why. So that being said, over the next 10 years or so, some of these games could easily work their way up to like $1,000 or more. I mean, we'll see. Time will tell. So here, Valkyrie Profile. I do see this one from time to time. Again, it's one that's just kind of followed the general trend here. Pandemic hit, it went up. Everybody wanted the retro games. And then it's kind of dipped back down. Then it's gone back up. Now it's dipped back down again. Persona. Let's check out some of these Persona games here because I think that so here you can see the Persona games. They've kind of had some value to them for a while. There's a pretty decent sized fan base for the Persona games, and that's one of the reasons why. And it's just gone up more gradually. And I think we're going to see a similar trend here with Persona 2. Although Persona Revelations, I always thought was the more rare Persona game. Let me know what you guys think, especially if you're a Persona fan. Team Buddies. Now, this is one that I think is pretty well recognized as one of the rarest games on the PlayStation. So it's commanded premium for a long time. I never see this game. I never see this game around. If I did, even here during this time at this price, I would have snagged it in the wild. But it got really expensive here and kind of worked its way down, but it's still commanding a premium. But look at that. That is strange. Do you guys know what happened here? How come it, was it just overinflated? But there's multiple sales and it just kind of climbed down. So I guess, look at this. If you weren't buying your copy with your stimulus check, that was your time to snag a copy of this game. And then it kind of went back up a bit. But still, this one might be undervalued. I am surprised that this one has not gone up more. More popular games, though, the Castlevania games, I've seen them go up for sure. Castlevania Chronicles seems to be one of the more expensive ones. It's gradually gone up, but yeah, the price has just exploded since the pandemic hit. Another game we're not going to see come down too much because of how sought after many Castlevania games are. And since we're not really getting good Castlevania games coming out from Konami, like it's almost like they've abandoned that franchise. Some of these older games, like the ones on the Super Nintendo and the PlayStation and the NES, are classics, and they're almost like must-haves in your collection. But there are a few, like this one, that are a bit harder to come by, obviously, than the others. And because of that, they have, such a high price tag on them. Let's take a look at some of these other games that are a little bit more common, or common uncommons, but they are popular because, some of the other consoles at the time sort of lacked these franchises to some degree, or these genres, to the extent that compared to PlayStation and what they had. So Resident Evil, obviously, this is going to go in the same boat as a lot of these other games. And something I was doing for PlayStation for a while there, around this time, 2014, 2015, 2016, was picking up some of these popular titles because they were readily available. Usually every game store, used game store, especially if they cater to retro, they'd have a copy of Resident Evil most often, or be able to get one in frequently enough. So stuff like Tomb Raider, Spyro, Crash Bandicoot, Resident Evil, Twisted Metal. I was picking these games up, and now we're really seeing them gain some momentum over the past 2 or 3 years because of the nostalgia factor, and because PlayStation really did represent some of these genres with a lot of the flagship titles and franchises that still hold up and are still around today. And Resident Evil stands out as one of those. So the pandemic, though, because I feel like this game was kind of already getting up there before. So here we see a $50 copy. But then, the pandemic hit and it shot up. I guess people were thinking the same thing too as I was, where let's get these flagship PlayStation titles, because they're the foundation of really any PlayStation collecting. That, the nostalgic titles for you, and some rares. Those are the games you want to have to sort of build a foundation of a collection. And it dipped back down. Obviously, this is going to happen because the game is a common game. And then it went up to about 100. Now it's just sitting under 100. So this game will begin to command a premium in the same way that something like Mario Kart or Mario 64 or Super Smash Brothers on the 64 commands a premium, because it's a flagship game. And like I said, if people are collecting this console and it's in that nostalgia factor time now, where people need to have this in their collection if they're going to collect for the PlayStation 1. Silent Hill games, and this can be said for almost all the Silent Hill games, they just keep going up and up and up. And I think we're starting to see some of the more recent Silent Hill games, like within the past 10 or 15 years, they're starting to see a little bit of value in them too. They're not going down. So Silent Hill's a franchise that you're going to want to snag as soon as you can for as cheap as you can. If you get the opportunity, pull the trigger, don't hesitate, because these games keep going up. And this is a prime example of what I was talking about earlier, where if you blink or you turn your head and you look back, the game's gone up in price. So it's very gradual with these games, but as you can see, like year to year, it goes up $5-10. So you can easily look one way at some other game or start collecting something else, turn around and the game's gone up $20. So it was going up even towards the pandemic to the $70 mark, and the pandemic just bumped it up. And this is really unbelievable. $200 at one point. So really it's going to be around here, $150, because that was before a couple sales that were really up there. It might come down a little bit more, but it's gonna sit above $100 now for a copy of Silent Hill. Unfortunately, even though it's not a rare game, it's just gonna be an expensive, sought-after game that people want. These horror games, they want them in their collection. So let's look at Clock Tower, because that's another one a little bit harder to come by. So Clock Tower is an uncommon game, where Silent Hill, I would say, is common, and that it was reflected in the price here for years and years, where it did have a bit of a premium to it, but wasn't really jumping up too fast in price, like some of the more popular common titles were creeping up there. So during the pandemic, it definitely went up, but it didn't go crazy until it looks like earlier this year, February, March, April, it just went nuts. But now it's come back down because those prices are kind of unreasonable. Shadow Tower. So here's a game you don't hear too much about. Definitely undervalued for a while. And I think here is kind of 2016, 2017 is sort of where we're seeing a bit of the nostalgia factor for the PlayStation, and that reflects a bit in this game. But this is more collectors entering into the market, because PlayStation, like back here, 2008, 2009, 2010, 11, was a really cheap time to collect for that console. We don't get to see it here. I'd like to talk more about it, because I picked up a bunch of games back then because, they were just a couple bucks. And this is one of the last consoles where we saw games only going for a couple bucks here and there, because PS2, Xbox, I guess we did sort of see that a while back, but not for very long. That window of games being discount is becoming smaller and smaller for a lot of these consoles. So here we go. This one worked its way up there, sort of stabilized itself just under $100, and then started to climb back up. And this is more of like, even though this is during the all the pandemic spending, it has more of a natural curve to it. So more people are recognizing this as a hard to find game, and that's why I think that it's gone up. Obviously, everything else that's affected these other games has affected this one too. But this is kind of nice to see an undervalued game going up, as opposed to some of these common games just shooting up in price because people are throwing money at retro games and the values are becoming a bit overinflated. Let's talk about the fighting games, because PlayStation had some of the best. And a lot of that stuff came from Capcom. Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter. I love this game. It's $40 for a long time, then $50, and I kind of seen this happening with a lot of these other games. You can look at Marvel versus Capcom 2. They all had their own premium because of the fighting game community and the fans of these games wanting to own them in their collection, including myself. And they kind of crept up over time because more people become fans of certain franchises as they continue, and just as fighting games in general, if you're a fan of that genre, you're always looking, for the next best thing. Even though you might have your go-to game or games, there's always fun fighting games out there worth checking out, and PlayStation is a great place to find a bunch of gems. So that's why this game and a lot of these other fighting games have just kind of crept up in value over time. Pandemic hit, and then we saw people saying like, hey, I got to have some of these great fighting games in my collection. I got some money. That's what I'm going to throw it at. Or people who just always wanted these games. And then this one, it was up there and then went down a bit, but not really. And then it's just kind of kept spiking again. So I think we'll see more of that from some of these fighting games where they do get these spikes and they come down, but they don't come down as low as they were here, and then they spike again, and then that's something that is just going to continue to happen with them because people want them. People want to play the fighting games, and they want to preserve them. They want to collect them. X-Men versus Street Fighter. I love this game. I love all these Capcom games. In fact, it looks like I'm just talking about the Capcom fighting games here. I have seen it with Darkstalkers. I'm not going to talk about that one too much. Darkstalkers 3. Really, the Capcom fighting games, they're classics. You can't go wrong with. I don't know why price charting has this. This is some type of error. It didn't go down to a $0 game. This is one that was, I remember being like a $40 game. I think I paid around that for it when I got it back in, I want to say 2011 or 12, which isn't recorded here, but that was a steady price for a while. That's something, like I mentioned, we're going to see with a lot of these fighting games. And then they just kind of creep up in price. Ignore this drop there. Just continue on here with it going 60, 70, working its way up gradually. Pandemic spike. I mean, I don't want to keep talking about the pandemic spike in the PlayStation Store because we know this happened, and this spiked a lot of these PlayStation games, and with the nostalgia factor. So Capcom versus SNK. This was one of the cheaper games. Yeah, $20 is about right, but it fits the same bill as a lot of these other games where it kind of crept up there. Became, $40 game where a lot of the other fighting games I'm talking about might have been 50, 60. But this one didn't really go up as gradually as some of these other fighting games. It looks like it just shot up with the pandemic. But it's still, this is still a cheaper game, Capcom versus SNK, compared to many of these other Capcom games. Rival Schools. So I just want to take a look at this one, because this is one that I don't have, and I really want to have in my collection. And I just never really ran across it that often, that I was able to pick it up here for like $40 or even 50 I would have. But I remember it being, a little bit more here. Yeah, maybe around the $70, $80 range here. This seems a little bit undervalued. And then this happened, and I did notice this because I was thinking, you know what, it is going to gradually go up over time like all of these other fighting games. Maybe I should pick up a copy. But apparently everybody else was thinking the same thing back in August of 2020, because look at that. That's crazy. That, I don't know if this is how correct this is. I mean, there are some other copies going over $100. So this game is over $100 now, and it's going to be there for a while because it looks like it dipped down maybe to just under 100 and then shot back up to some crazy price. So these fighting games, I think, are going to hold their value. They do have this trend of holding their value and just kind of gradually climbing up over time with a couple peaks and valleys, and that's just what we're going to see with fighting games on the PlayStation and horror games. So there is always going to be a demand for them, nostalgia for them, and communities that want to play them and collect them. That's it for this episode of Playas Guide. I've covered the PlayStation now. I've covered the PlayStation 3. I'm going to do the PlayStation 2 eventually. I know these videos are out of sequence, but I'm kind of giving priority to certain consoles that I'm really noticing more of a market change in. At the end of the year, I'm going to do a general sort of market analysis and then a predictions video of what I think we'll see next year in the overall video game market and some of the different consoles. Some of the consoles I might not talk about just because there's either not enough kind of happening with them. Like Wii U, I'm noticing some different games that have really kind of shot up in value, and games that are rare that have diminished in value. And then with the PlayStation 3, there's been spikes all over the place, and I really wanted to talk about that. Same with some of these other consoles. PS1 sort of just kind of following the market trend for video game collecting, nostalgia, everything that happened with COVID. So not a lot going on there that maybe you didn't already know about if you're following, the general market of collecting. But I did want to touch on the horror games, the fighting games, and a couple RPGs and the flagship titles. I didn't get to talking about Tomb Raider, some of those games, but Tomb Raider was like a $5 game for years and years. I don't know what it's going for now. I'm going to say like 10 or 15 bucks. So maybe 20 at some game stores. it's gone up because a lot of people are looking for those flagship titles, and some of them are still very cheap. So, you know, even though they've gone up, they're still affordable, and it's up to you whether you want to collect those or not. I hope to see you this Saturday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time when I review the state of Super Nintendo collecting in 2021. And then if you have questions, I'm going to have a little bit more time and be able to go into more detail, because there are things in this video that I do have to cut out, just because I don't want to have this ginormous 2-hour video of me rambling about collecting and every single game. I just can't do that. The video would never end, and I'd probably be losing my voice. Anyways, hopefully I'll see you Saturday or next week for the retro gaming news. I'll catch you on the flip side.